So welcome back from your break. Let's answer this question very quickly, and then we'll move on. So how does genetic drift differ from gene flow in terms of how they occur? So remember, genetic drift is a random change in the gene pool because individuals are randomly eliminated. Some people use the term acts of God, so fires, floods, famines, things like that, arbitrary events that arbitrarily eliminate individuals from the population. That's genetic drift. Gene flow, remember, is loss of genetic variation because of collapses in the population due to bottlenecking, which is not just arbitrary removal of individuals, it's complete collapse of the population, or where small groups of individuals are arbitrarily removed from the population by an event like a storm moving birds from one location to another, as is the case for the Darwinian finches in the Galapagos, or the tortoises or any other organisms that live in the Galapagos. You have a random selection from the gene pool, not an average selection from the gene pool. So what are the implications for the genetic variation in the population? In the case of both of them, a loss of genetic variation is almost inevitable. It is possible that it may lead to some adaptive change, but that would be extremely unusual. Almost inevitably, both of these processes lead to a loss of genetic variation and therefore a challenge to the survivors. They are threatened with extinction through loss of genetic variation. So we want to take a close look now at natural selection, because natural selection of the three mechanisms is the one that allows for the accumulation of favorable genotypes and therefore favorable, as a consequence of preservation of favorable phenotypes in a population. So you want to take a really close look now at natural selection and what effect it could have on a population. So one of the things that we need to recognize is that when natural selection is in operation on a population, it is always going to result in a population that is better suited or better fitted to its environment. It is going to create a better adapted population, because if natural selection doesn't lead to a better adapted population, you get extinction. So either a population has to adapt as a consequence of favorable mutations being preserved, or it's going to fail to adapt because there are no favorable mutations for a particular environmental change, and therefore it becomes extinct. So natural selection at work is always going to involve in the survival and thriving of populations that are better adapted to their environment. That's the key to natural selection, which distinguishes it and differentiates it from gene flow and genetic drift. They hardly ever, if ever, result in a better adapted population. So one of the issues is that some of the popular phrases that are used for natural selection, and mind you, Wallace and Darwin both recognized that these phrases would become commonly used. They were already being used in their lifetime, and they both commiserated with each other through their letters, that their preference would be for the term descent with modification to be used, but that descent with modification did not sound anywhere near as cool. Obviously, they didn't use the word cool, but didn't sound anywhere near as cool as struggle for existence or survival of the fittest. And they realized that these terms would become attached to natural selection and evolution. And the problem here is that it's not all about survival of the fittest, it's survival of the adequate. If you happen to have sets of traits that allow you to survive and therefore reproduce, you are going to make a contribution to the next generation. And sometimes it's not always obvious what the adaptations are, what the differences are that are going to lead to your success. They may not necessarily always be particularly obvious. And it may not necessarily be one particular trait is the key. It's really the combination of traits. It is hardly ever a particular single phenotype, but a collection of phenotypes that leads to survival. And as a consequence of that, because many phenotypes have subtle differences, it may not always be obvious that certain individuals are necessarily the best fit. It may appear that a number of different individuals appear to be the best fit because the subtlety of the differences and the subtlety of what is allowing for their reproductive success is not necessarily always obvious. It may be hidden, but nonetheless, there will be something involved. So determining evolutionary fitness can be somewhat difficult. However, what really does determine evolutionary fitness is your contribution to the gene pools of subsequent generations. And we never measure it in terms of the flow of your genes into the immediate next generation. It's really all about how many generations from you do your genes keep turning up in the gene pool. Because the fitness of your genes, which is the only thing that matters, is measured by how far into the future do they pass from one generation to the next. Because remember again, different individuals may make contributions to the gene pool, but they may not necessarily have the absolute best fit. They happen to be adequate. They survive, they are adequate to survive, to survive and thrive and reproduce. So they will obviously make a contribution to the gene pool of the next generation. But if their genes ultimately don't turn out to be the best combination, those genes will eventually disappear from the gene pool of subsequent generations. So it's really not all about what contribution do you make to the next generation. It's what contribution do you make to multiple generations into the future in terms of your genes passing from one generation to the next. And that's measured by relative fitness, not absolute fitness. So what we're looking for is not just the passage of your genes into the next generation, but your passage into the genes of subsequent generations. That's the true measure of fitness. So when we start looking at natural selection working on a population, we recognize that there are three different ways the gene pool can move. And we refer to these as directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. And rather than talk about the notes, you can read this, it's fairly straightforward. But basically, you can see on this diagram what each one of these mechanisms looks like. So directional works on a population where all of these are actually working on a population where there's a continuum of traits. So we need to start with that. And directional favors one end of the spectrum of traits versus the other. And so the population tends to move to one end of the spectrum or the continuum. That's directional, it moves in one direction. So you see movement in, oops, the pen is on. You see movement in this direction. Movement is towards one extreme versus the other. In disruptive, the central group, the middle of the continuum, is not favored, but the two extremes are favored. And so you see two populations emerging, which may eventually become two separate species, but you at least see two populations emerging that represent the two extremes that are favored. In direction, you tend to see a continuum, but the continuum is restricted in that one end of the continuum disappears, representing the movement in the direction of the other end of the continuum. In disruptive, you see a loss of the middle of the continuum and two populations emerging that represent the two extremes of the continuum. In stabilizing, you see the loss of the extremes and a movement towards the central part of the continuum. And here you tend to see a loss of phenotypic variation. But one of the things that you should always realize when you look at all three of these is that all three mechanisms lead to a loss of phenotypic variation. And you could conclude from that that there is a parallel loss of genotypic variation. And to some degree, you would be correct. And that could be problematic for natural selection, because remember what we've been stressing all the way through this presentation up to this point is that genetic variation is central. Genetic variation is key. The more genetic variation you have, the more likely natural selection is going to occur, the better it is for a population or for a species. So if the effect of natural selection is to actually restrict phenotypic variation and therefore potentially restrict genetic variation, how can we maintain genetic variation in a population in the face of pressure from natural selection to restrict genetic variation through restriction of phenotypic variation? Well, that's what we're going to focus on for most of the rest of this presentation. So let's take a look at how we can maintain genetic variation in the face of what appears to be a mechanism that will lead to a loss of genetic variation. So here are the three basic mechanisms. Being diploid. So how does being diploid lead to genetic variation? Well, diploidy also allows for the possibility of heterozygosity. So as soon as you have the diploid condition, you also have the possibility of heterozygotes. And remember, heterozygotes always have two different alleles. And if the favored trait is also the dominant trait, that allows for the retention of alleles for something other than the dominant trait as the second allele in the heterozygotes. So heterozygotes are really important as a consequence of the diploid condition. Balancing selection and neutral variation, I'll talk about in more detail when we get to them, only because it's very difficult to give you a simple definition of these. It's much easier to, well, actually neutral variation I can. So neutral variation is variation that has no selective benefit. In other words, the traits that are caught up in neutral variation, like a hitchhiker's thumb, free versus attached earlobes, hair on the back of your hands, all of those things that you may have played with in our human phenotypes lab in Bio 1. Those are all neutral variations because they don't have any selective benefit. They're neither an advantage or a disadvantage. They just are. And they represent what makes us different from each other. Now, at this point in time, they may not have an advantage, but we don't know that they might not have an advantage at some point in the future. There used to be one trait that we used to look at in human phenotypes where we had you tasting for the presence of bitter chemicals. And we know that in the past, that almost certainly did have a selective benefit because toxic substances tend to be bitter. And so someone who was a non-taster, couldn't taste these bitter substances, would almost certainly eat something that was toxic and die from poisoning. And for those of us who could taste it, well, we could spit out the bitter chemicals. And when we saw people dying from eating the same food that we were spitting out, we'd go, oh, well, that's probably the reason why we won't eat that anymore. And so people who were non-tasters of these bitter chemicals became a mechanism, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, for identifying those things that we could or couldn't eat. Today, that's not such a big deal because we have other ways of figuring it out. But there are all sorts of neutral variations that organisms possess that today may not be an advantage, but you don't know if that will be the case in the future, because remember again, variations that are advantageous have to be advantageous in the right time and the right location. So what may be a variation today that has no benefit and is neutral may turn out in the future to be beneficial. So that's why neutral variations are important. So we talked about the diploid condition. In the case of balancing selection, there is a balance between different morphs or different phenotypes. So morph is simply a fancy term for phenotype. And so in balancing selection, you automatically have a population that shows polymorphism. Morphs or phenotypes that are present in high enough numbers that you recognize they exist, and they are relatively stable in the population. They're stable enough that they are maintained within the population. And there are a number of different ways of being able to do this. So one way involves heterozygotes again, and it's referred to as the heterozygous advantage. And this is where the sickle cell allele comes into play. Because if we look at the distribution of the sickle cell allele and match that up with the distribution of the malaria parasite, what we notice is that in regions where the sickle cell allele is present in the population in high numbers, there's also a high incidence of the malaria parasite. And it turns out that the malaria parasite, Plasmodium falciparum, and we'll talk more about this because it is a member of the Old Kingdom Protista. And we will talk about it as an organism of interest as we talk about the taxonomy of life. And you'll get to see microscope slides of it. It turns out that the Plasmodium does not attack sickle cells or cells that contain some of the sickle hemoglobin. So in the case of heterozygous individuals that have the normal allele for the beta subunit of hemoglobin and the sickle cell hemoglobin, beta globin, they are not attacked by the malaria parasite. Neither are individuals who have sickle cell anemia. Unfortunately, however, the individuals with sickle cell anemia are subject to death from the complications of sickle cell. Individuals who have normal hemoglobin, well, their red blood cells can be attacked by the Plasmodium, and untreated malaria is still lethal, and it still kills about 2 or 3 million people around the world every year. So it's still considered to be a major public health issue. But individuals who are heterozygous, they neither suffer from sickle cell, or at least they have very, very mild symptoms that do not shorten their lifespan, which is the case for people with sickle cell. They do not contract malaria and therefore die of the complications of malaria. They have the best of both worlds. They are protected against malaria, and they don't have the complication by the sickle cell allele, but they don't have the complications of sickle cell. And it's referred to as the heterozygous advantage, and it's a well-recognized evolutionary advantage. And it is a way of maintaining what would be otherwise a very disadvantageous allele in a population, because fortunately sickle cell happens to be a recessive trait. So That's why the sickle cell allele and partner alleles of similar characteristic occur in West Africa and Central Africa, in the Middle East and the northeastern Mediterranean, in Nepal and northern India, because mutations have occurred in these regions that provide a natural immunity to malaria. And while we don't have a huge amount of time, I don't have a huge amount of time to go into this today, perhaps I'll write up a small piece and post it to the class about why the high frequency of sickle cell and the sickle cell allele here in North America, the Caribbean and South America actually exists, and the reason why it is a historical reason, and it is no accident. It was a deliberately planned event that led to this outcome. And I'll give you a hint, it has everything to do with slavery. But I'll post a piece on this. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to get into it right now. So let's move on. So the heterozygous advantage is obviously a way of maintaining genetic variation. And again, it's a direct product of the diploid condition. Then we have another situation called frequency-dependent selection. And here, the frequency of a particular morph in a population determines its survival in the population. So in this case, when a particular morph becomes too frequent, it gets selected against. And a second morph becomes more common. But as that morph becomes more common, it becomes selected against, and the previous morph rises. And you might be going, huh, what do you mean by that? Let me show you the classic example, because this is the one that actually led to this idea being developed. So in the Rift Valley region of East Africa, there are a number of Great Lakes. We talk about the Great Lakes of East Africa. This includes Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Nyeri. These lakes have come and gone over geological time. At times there have been one huge, large lake in East Africa. At other times, there have been a lot of smaller lakes. Right now, there are about 4 or 5 large lakes and a lot of little lakes. And because of this, it's been an area of high evolutionary processing. And this has been seen most clearly amongst a group of fish called the cichlid fish. There are some 200 to 300 different species of cichlid fish. And the reason why there are so many of them is simply because these lakes have come and gone and created and removed multiple environments over time. So the 2 species of cichlid fish that are of interest, or the species of cichlid fish that are of interest here is this species P. microlepis. It comes in 2 morphs that are clearly identifiable. And what sets them apart is the fact that their mouths are offset to the left or right, respectively. And the reason why this is the case is because these are parasitic fish. They parasitize other fish and they suck the mucus and scales off the surface of the skin of the fish as a source of nutrition. And obviously they are aggravating to the fish that they're parasitizing and preying upon. So the right-mouthed fish sneaks up on the left side of their prey, and the left-mouthed fish sneaks up on the right side of their prey. And if you look at the chart that accompanies the picture here, you can see that the right mouth versus left mouth morph varies over time. And the reason why is very simple. If the left mouth fish, which is the one for whom the data has been collected, is prominent in the population, the prey fish are constantly being attacked from the right-hand side, and they learn very quickly to look to the right to protect themselves from predation or parasitism by the left mouth morph. This obviously gives the right mouth morph an advantage because it can now sneak up unseen. And so it has a better opportunity to feed, it thrives, it reproduces more, it starts to increase in number at the disadvantage of the left mouth fish. But when the right mouth fish increases in numbers, the prey fish now start to get parasitized or preyed on from the left-hand side more frequently due to the right-hand side. And they quickly learn that that's the case and they start paying more attention to the left-hand side. That means the right mouth fish is now at a disadvantage, but the left mouth fish now has the advantage. And so it starts to be more successful. It thrives more, it reproduces more. And so the numbers of left mouth fish increase. And so it seesaws backwards and forwards, one morph not having a distinct advantage over the other morph for an extended period of time, simply because of the nature of what the morph determines in terms of behavior of the two fish or the two morphs. And so neither has a distinct advantage over time. One only has the advantage so long as its numbers are low in the population. When it rises to higher frequency, it actually becomes disadvantaged and suffers as a consequence. This is frequency determined selection or frequency imbalancing detection. And obviously it's a way of maintaining genetic variation in the population. Could this change over time? Sure, but under the circumstances right now, neither of the two morphs have a distinct advantage. They only have the advantage when they actually are the lower frequency morph in the population. And then we've talked about neutral variation, and I gave you a pretty fair and appropriate explanation of neutral variation, so I won't go into this in any more detail, other than just to remind you again that these are variations that have no advantage or disadvantage. They are just variations in physical appearance that make individuals different from each other. Could they pose a selective advantage in the future? Sure, but right now they don't. Then neither do they pose a disadvantage, so they just vary according to randomness in the population. And humans have a lot of these neutral variations, as do most species. So the last type of selection that I want to refer to is one that Darwin struggled with. I'm not entirely sure about Wallace, because Wallace never really wrote a lot about sexual selection, but Darwin paid a lot of notice to sexual selection because he realized that it was occurring, that selection was being made on the basis of sex in terms of mating partners, and that sexual characteristics were being used for selecting mating partners. And as a consequence of this, sexual dimorphism could occur. In other words, the males and the females could have characteristics that were distinctly different from each other, and therefore it would be very easy to differentiate males from females. But there must be a reason for why those sexually based characteristics were occurring and why they were being selected for. And Darwin could not really figure out why sexual selection occurred. He wrote a number of different hypotheses, but he could never really figure out why. And he was finally forced to admit that he could not make sense of why sexual selection occurred. There are two basic types of sexual selection. One is intrasexual selection, where the selection is on the basis of struggle between one of the two sexes for access to mates. And this is almost invariably males competing for access to females. Not necessarily always the case, but most of the time it's males competing for access to females. So in this situation, you're almost certainly going to have sexual dimorphism, because the males are going to develop characteristics that are going to allow them to compete against other males for access to the mates. So this is the reason why horns have developed, and in many species where there are horned males, there is competition, head-butting, and all sorts of things that go on to try and maintain control and access to a group of females. Think in terms of deer, caribou, elk, antelopes, those sorts of animals. But you also may see this in terms of body size. So if you're thinking about this as in terms of body size, think in terms of gorillas, where the mating is carried out mostly by the dominant male, the silverback, who is substantially bigger than any of the females. There's a huge difference in body size. And the reason why is because the male is going to have to fight other males to maintain his dominance. And sooner or later, he's going to lose. And you can think in terms of other animals where you see this. So a lot of pinnipeds, the seals and sea lions, the males are substantially bigger than the females, and they often fight for access to the females and maintaining their own harems on the beach. In the case of humans, yes, there is a little bit of size dimorphism in the case of males versus females, but not as much as there are in others of the apes, which suggests that males in Homo sapiens don't carry out as much combat for access to females, and never have, as we might find evidence in other animals, where there is a distinct difference in size. Then the other type of sexual selection is intersexual selection, where there is a choice on the basis of one gender for mates from a second gender. And the choosing is usually the females that make the choosing. And the classic example here is the peacock's tail. And you might wonder why the female is choosing amongst males with these large tails, and why the males have these tails in the first place. There have been many different arguments made for this. But what we do know now from experimentation is that there is a size limit to how big the tail can get. So a male with a 3-meter long tail will almost certainly get many mating opportunities, but a male with a 4-meter long tail won't. And the reason is quite simple. A male with a 3-meter tail can still fly, and fly reasonably well to get away from predators, which are primarily tigers, because peacocks are native to the Indian subcontinent. With a 4-meter tail, the male can't fly, and so he's going to get eaten by tigers. So the females clearly are selecting on the size of the tail, and research indicates that the females will tolerate a tail up to a certain length, above which they simply say, no, I'm not going to mate with that, not going to work. So why is she making this selection? And on what basis is he making this selection? Well, it's kind of interesting, because we now realize that she's making this not because she's thinking about all of her chicks, but she's thinking primarily about her male chicks. The female chicks don't have to worry about mating opportunities, because remember, the females are the ones that are doing the picking here. So her female chicks will always have an opportunity to mate, because they're the ones that are going to be choosing who they mate with. But her male chicks, they're in a different boat, because they're the ones that are being picked. So she's looking at the males and looking at the tails and going, which of these males are going to give my male chicks the best opportunity? And that's the basis on which she's choosing. So a male with a tail that is way too long, she's not going to choose him, because her male chicks will have too long a tail. They'll get eaten. They won't be able to have a mating opportunity. Now, whether that's mentally the process she's going through, or whether her instinct makes her choose on this basis, we don't know, because obviously we can't ask the question. But it certainly seems to be the case that she's choosing on the basis of what her male chicks will possess, not what her female chicks will possess. Now, there's a lot more interesting stuff we could talk about here in terms of mating behaviors. how does human mating behavior reflect the mating behavior of other animals? The one thing we can say is that it certainly doesn't match the mating behaviors of our ape cousins, because when we look at our ape cousins, their mating practices usually involve either males that are extremely large in competition for females, or females that mate with multiple males in order to create conflict in the mind of the males as to who the father actually is. So that's the gorillas versus the chimpanzees. Or in the case of bonobos, hey, let's mate with everybody. They actually use sex as a way of disarming conflict. So when there is the potential for conflict, they simply have sex with each other, and it is not gender-based. So it could be same gender sex or opposite gender sex, but they typically use this as a way of reducing conflict in the population. Both chimps and bonobos have matriarchal societies. It is run by the females, but where there is a substantial amount of aggression on the part of the males, chimpanzees, the females simply mate with multiple males in order to make sure that the males do not view the young as potential young from other fathers, and therefore kill them and eat them, which they have been known to do when they come across young that they know for sure are not their own. It is not unknown for male chimps to kill the young and eat them. Cannibalism. So the females clearly want to protect their young, so they simply create conflict in the minds of the males by mating with many of them so that they don't know for sure who the father is. So one of the interesting things, and I'll stop on this one as far as sexual selection is concerned, one of the more interesting questions we can ask is, if we look at apes and we think about males and their testicles, because testicles are the source of the sperm, which of the apes, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the orangutans, and the gibbons, because we can put the gibbons in there as well, even though they are sometimes called lesser apes, which of the, and humans, which of the apes have the largest testicles compared to body size? Now, I usually let students think about that one if we're doing this in class. Obviously, we can't do that here, so I'm just going to go ahead and answer the question. First glance, you might think, well, gorillas are the largest of the apes. Surely they have the biggest testicles. And you'd be wrong. Compared to body size, amongst the apes, gorillas actually have some of the smallest testicles. And the reason why is quite simple, because there is no competition. The silverback male, the dominant male, is the one who's going to mate with most of the females, and therefore his sperm is not going to be competing with other male sperms because he's the one who's doing the mating. No, the apes that have the largest testicles compared to body size are the chimpanzees. Remember, the females mate with multiple males. So the way the males try and overcome that is by having huge testicles compared to their body size, making large quantities of sperm, so that ultimately they can have a lot of their sperm available in the uterus and the fallopian tubes, increasing the likelihood that their sperm actually fertilizes the egg. It's all about sperm competition, and that's the way they get around the females mating with multiple males and increase the likelihood of their sperm doing the fertilization. So where does that leave humans? Where do we sit in all of this? We actually are somewhere in the middle. Our testicles are not as large as chimpanzees. They're actually substantially smaller, but they are certainly larger by body size than those of gorillas, which suggests that, again, in human history and in human mating behavior, there is little evidence to suggest that there's been a lot of competition on the basis of males for access to mates. There may have been some in the past. There is some suggestion based on human behavior, that it may still be something that occurs now, but it's not physical conflict, at least we hope not, but conflict or competition in other ways. And you can think through, you know what those are. Who's got the biggest set of, who's got the greatest set of toys, who's got the best looks, da 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 da. So yeah, maybe there is some basis for saying that there's competition between human males for access to mates, but nowhere near in the way that you would see in the gorillas, or multiple mating opportunities as you would see in chimpanzees. There are a lot more things we could talk about, but again, I don't have time to cover all of that. So, given that sexual reproduction is a major form of reproduction amongst organisms, it is overwhelmingly the form of reproduction that's used by most organisms. Why does it continue when there is such an overhead associated with sexual reproduction? And you might say, but where's the overhead? Surely if it's successful, there's no overhead. Well, here's where the overhead occurs. If you are asexually reproducing, you only ever have to reproduce one offspring in order to maintain the continuity of the species. And because all you need to do is produce a copy of yourself to reproduce, you can do so very quickly. And you can reproduce to large numbers without too much hassle. But if you are sexually reproducing, at each generation, each female necessarily has to produce two offspring of opposite gender in order for there to be ongoing sexual reproduction. It also means you have to find a willing mating partner, and one that is capable of producing satisfactory offspring. So there is an essential overhead to sexual reproduction, nor can you reproduce to the same numbers in the same amount of time. Sexual reproduction is necessarily slower at reproducing large numbers of offspring. So the question becomes, why is it maintained? And the answer seems to be because it affects the ability of individuals to resist the effect of parasites, particularly bacterial, viral, and fungal-based parasites, and microorganism-like parasites. We rely on our immune system primarily to do that if we're animals. And the only way to create huge amounts of variation in the immune system is through sexual reproduction, creating genetic variation. And there's a huge body of work starting to emerge that suggests that this is the basis for sexual reproduction. Yes, sexual reproduction does create a greater chance of success for the organisms that practice, but it seems to be all about producing resistance against parasites that can mutate faster than you can, and therefore are more flexible in terms of becoming or continuing to be pathogenic than you can be in terms of altering your immune system generation to generation to resist those parasites. Sexual reproduction is the answer, but it is barely the answer. It allows organisms to maintain enough flexibility in their immune system to just keep up with the parasites. It's become known as the Red Queen effect. It's named after a character from one of the Alice in Wonderland books. The Red Queen was discovered by Alice to be running furiously in place. And when asked why, the Red Queen answered, "Because, my dear, in this world, you have to run as fast as you can just to stay in one place, just to keep up." And that's why this has become known as the Red Queen effect. And it's a well-recognized effect now in biology. So finally, one of the questions we might always ask is, why is there no such thing as a perfect organism as a product of evolution? Why is everything always a compromise? And the answer is because evolution rarely, if ever, and in fact, I can't think of a situation where this is actually happening, where evolution produces a brand new solution to a problem de novo, from scratch, from a blank sheet of paper. It's always about tinkering with what exists already. So part of the problem for natural selection is that it can only tinker and modify with what already exists. And so consequently, there's always going to be a limitation to what natural selection and evolution can produce. We're starting to realize that one of the reasons why we see a limited number of solutions to some problems, like flight, for instance, which we talked about before, is simply because there are historical constraints, historical limits placed on what you can and can't do. And it appears that in terms of flight, there are only three basic options: the bird wing, the mammal wing as seen in the back, or the insect wing. There are no other solutions to powered flight in the animal kingdom, at least, because of the constraints on what you can and can't do in producing new novel modifications. So as a consequence, any adaptation that takes place is by necessity a compromise, because you can only tinker with what exists. There's only a limit to what you can do without destroying the functionality of the item. And so there is always got to be a compromise to what you wind up with. And remember, ultimately, it's all about having the appropriate tinkered adaptation at the right time in the right location. No matter how many individuals may have produced in the past the killer adaptation that would have been perfect in another time and another location, if it emerges in the right time, in the wrong time, in the wrong location, it doesn't matter. It dies with the individual that has it, because it has no purpose. They always have to be appropriate to the time and to the place. So the last slide for this presentation shows a compromise, or a potential compromise that is starting to emerge. Here is a bat that specializes in eating frogs. It is known as the frog-eating bat. Yeah, go figure. What is the frog doing that attracts the bat? Well, we know that male frogs croak. So when you hear frogs croaking, it's a male frog that's doing it, and does it to attract a mate. The bats simply home in on the sound of the frogs croaking. So the males are at risk of being eaten by the frog-eating bats, if I'm saying that correctly, because they've got to croak in order to attract a mate. But a frog's got to do what a frog's got to do. If it wants to mate, it's got to croak. But that puts it at risk of being predated. There is emerging in a couple of species of frogs males that don't croak. And your immediate reaction to that would probably be, so how do they attract mates? If the croaking is how they attract mates, if you don't croak, you don't get to mate. Yet we see a percentage of non-croaking males being preserved in a population. So that suggests that these non-croaking males must have some sort of advantage. Well, obviously the advantage is they don't croak, so they don't get eaten by the bats. So how do they get to mate in order to propagate the non-croaking phenotype? They've developed an interesting behavior. They stand next to the males that are croaking. The females home in on the croaking males, but the bats also home in on the croaking males. They get eaten, leaving the non-croaking males to sit there to greet the females that come looking for the mate as a consequence of the croaking males. That's their real advantage. They take advantage of the croaking frogs to attract the males, when the croaking frogs get eliminated by the bats, the non-croaking frogs are still there to mate with the females when they turn up. It's kind of a cool behavior. It's nature at its best. It's natural selection at its best. It's evolution at its best. But it also has a downside. Because remember, if those non-croaking males should increase to a significant percentage, that's going to eliminate their advantage, because as non-croakers, they're not going to be able to attract the females. So there's going to have to be a balance reached at some point, or there's going to have to be a change in behavior on the females that lead them to be attracted to the non-croaking males in some fashion, in order for the non-croaking to increase to really significant numbers. Because right now, the only way that the non-croakers can get access to the females is to take advantage of the croaking males. So the croaking males have to persist in order for the non-croaking males to be able to mate. Evolution is really interesting. It's really curious, and natural selection's tinkering can often lead to some really unusual and bizarre behaviors and forms and phenotypes. And some of those we may encounter later in the semester. But for now, we're at the end of this chapter. I've got one more set of concept check questions, or a concept check question. So why is evolution considered to be the only evolutionary mechanism that consistently leads to adaptive evolution in the population? Because natural selection is the only one that selects on the basis of advantage versus disadvantage. In genetic drift, in gene flow, there is no selection on the basis of advantage versus disadvantage. It is truly random. And so it may lead to an advantage, but it typically doesn't. It almost invariably leads to a disadvantage. But in adaptive evolution, in natural selection, it always leads to a better adapted population, because it's always selecting for the advantage. So that's why evolution through natural selection is the only mechanism. That should say natural selection, not evolution. So let me put this in. That should be natural. So why is natural selection considered to be the only evolutionary mechanism that consistently leads to population? Because natural selection is the only one that selects on the basis of advantage. Everything else selects randomly. So that's it for this chapter. Hopefully you've learned something. But if you still have questions or concerns or comments about anything that I've covered in this chapter, by all means, come and see me during office hours or shoot me an email, and I'll be more than happy to help you clear up any uncertainties that you might have. So until next time, be safe, and we'll see you back here again for chapter 24. Bye for now.